Subject of Desire, written by Holy, and read for you by ASTRO BRONY. The summer sun was warm on Sunset's back as the day drew to a close. After a long day of hanging out with the rest of the girls, she was happy to head back for the night. Even with her fatigued body, Sunset couldn't help but smile. Summer was her favorite time of the year, and she took every chance she could to enjoy it. Sunset closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the evening air as it settled in, not particularly mindful of what was ahead of her on the sidewalk. The sudden interruption of another body in her path jolted her out of her reverie, and the sound of a clipboard clattering to the concrete resounded in front of her. Her cheeks flushed as she chastised herself for not paying more attention. She immediately went down onto her hands and knees to help the poor soul she just ran into by picking up the clipboard. Sunset stood up with the clipboard in her hand.
Oh, I am so sorry. Are you alright?
Her jaw dropped, and her hand lost its grip on the clipboard, letting it clatter to the ground yet again.
Twilight?
Sunset stared, perplexed at the sight in front of her. None other than the human form of the familiar pony princess stood before her, albeit with her messy hair in a bun, a pair of glasses, and sporting a dorky lab coat. Twilight was taken aback for a moment. She looked over Sunset with suspicious eyes, and leaned down to pick her clipboard back up.
And just... how do you know my name?
Twilight asked, keeping a skeptical gaze on Sunset.
What? It's me, Twilight. Sunset Shimmer?
Twilight looked Sunset up and down again, crossing her arms over her chest.
I've never heard of any Sunset Shimmer.
Taking her eyes off of Sunset for a moment, she pursed her lips in thought, before snapping attention back to the girl in front of her.
Say, you wouldn't happen to be enrolled in Canterlot High, would you, Miss Shimmer?
Sunset spared a laugh at being called Miss.
Yeah, but you...
Sunset stopped and looked Twilight over herself. It finally hit her that this wasn't the same girl she'd been writing to for the past few months. She spared another laugh at herself for not realizing this sooner. All of Twilight's other friends had counterparts in this world, so it would only make sense that Twilight would too.
Can you tell me all that's happened there in the past few months? Particularly the events of the last fall and the recent musical event?
Twilight asked, clicking a pen in one hand and readying her clipboard in the other, eager to soak up any bit of information with an interested expression. Sunset looked away.
Well, that's actually a really long story.
Local news reports said that the causes were gas leaks causing the property damage and major technical malfunctions during the latter event. Is this not true?
What? Of course not. It was me turning into a crazed she-demon and the sirens trying to control all the other students.
Sunset said in an even tone that didn't quite match the extravagant explanation she'd just given. Twilight stared at her in disbelief, her pen hovering motionless above the paper, unsure of where to even begin.
A she-demon?
Twilight finally asked, after a long period of awkward silence. Sunset felt a blush form on her cheeks and looked away. She rubbed the back of her neck and found interest in a nearby lawn to try and get away from the situation.
Yeah, it was this whole thing with me trying to steal the crown from my home world of Equestria and trying to take over this world with its power. And then...
Equestria? Is that some kind of planet? You mean you're an alien?
Twilight's eyes lit up with wonder. She gasped in delight, and a sudden, joyous smile spread across her face as she came uncomfortably close to Sunset, circling around her and under her arms to look at every part of her.
I wouldn't say alien. You see, I came from a world of Hey!
Sunset jumped away as the curious Twilight prodded her in the side with her pen.
Oh, this is fascinating! Does your race use some sort of advanced technology to emulate the human form? Is your planet close to our solar system? Or is it even in this galaxy? How did you learn our language? Are you a carbon-based life form or something else like phosphorus? Nitrogen? Oh, is it silicon?
Twilight asked at such speed that Sunset could hardly keep up. She continued to probe and pester every corner of her body, until Sunset finally spun around and grabbed Twilight by the hand to stop her.
I'm not...
Sunset took a deep breath to let out the stress of being so thoroughly examined. She let Twilight's hand go, an apologetic look crossing her face.
Look, I'm not an alien. My world is pretty similar to this one, but I don't think this is really the time or place to go through all this, do you?
Sunset motioned to the setting sun and the darkening suburb around them. Twilight, however, wasn't getting the hint.
How silly of me. I don't have anything I need to properly conduct an examination here. Let's go back to my house.
Twilight said, quickly grabbing Sunset by the wrist and pulling her down the sidewalk.
Hey! That's not really what I meant!
Sunset tried to tell Twilight, but she was far beyond being convinced out of this. Sunset figured that she might as well answer some of her questions. She deserved that much. After being whisked through the neighborhood and into her house, Twilight dragged Sunset into her room, which was a mess of scribbled notes, lab equipment, and pictures of Canterlot High and news reports of the events plastered all over her wall. Sunset raised an eyebrow at the lengths this girl went to just to find out what most people in the town already knew. Sunset would be lying if she said she wasn't at least a little bit creeped out. Twilight left her there, going into the bathroom to make some sort of preparations, as she said. Sunset didn't pay it much mind, as she continued to look over the room with some concern. Hopefully, she thought, with a few answers this could be resolved quickly. Sunset distracted herself with the thought of introducing her to some of her friends. There was also a certain blue-haired guitarist that would love to make her acquaintance. By the looks of the fanatical lengths she had gone to, this girl looked like she could really use a boyfriend. Twilight peeked her head out from the bathroom door, an excited smile on her face.
Okay, Sunset, I'm ready to begin. Please step into the bathroom and we can get started.
Alright.
Sunset said, as she cautiously followed. Once she entered the bathroom, everything looked mostly normal for a teenage girl's bathroom, albeit much more organized. That is, until she spotted the table with quite a few medical instruments laid out neatly on it, as well as a fresh notebook and pen. Sunset's heart skipped a beat when she saw the pair of handcuffs Twilight was holding.
Twilight? What do you need those for?
Sunset said, pointing to the bonding device in Twilight's hand.
Oh, these? It's nothing to worry about. Just a safety precaution, in case you have some sort of adverse reaction.
Twilight said nonchalantly, an eager smile still on her face.
Now, if you would please take a seat, we can get started.
Twilight gestured towards the stool under the towel rack next to the table. Every single one of Sunset's instincts told her to hightail it out of there and never ever go back. Handcuffs and sharp medical instruments never mixed well, according to some of the movies Rainbow Dash had made her sit through. With an uneasy expression, Sunset sat down. Sunset's breath caught in her throat as Twilight started towards her, opening one handcuff and reaching for her wrist. Sunset let out a breath she didn't know she was holding when Twilight stopped, suddenly perking up as if remembering something.
Oh, I almost forgot. I'm going to need you to take off your jacket and shirt as well.
Twilight said, as if those words carried no weight.
What?
Sunset felt a blush run across her face. This was not what she expected when she decided to follow Twilight home. The other Twilight was never this forward.
Well, once you're restrained, I can't take them off myself, can I?
Sunset gave Twilight a face painted in exasperation. This time, Twilight took at least some hint.
Oh, don't worry, Miss Shimmer. It's only a rudimentary physical examination. It's no big deal.
Sunset took a deep breath. Perhaps she was just overreacting.
Okay. If you say so.
Reluctantly, Sunset slipped out of her leather jacket and pulled her shirt over her head, leaving both on the floor below her. She felt extremely uncomfortable as the cold air began to brush against her bare skin, her bra the only thing sheltering her upper body from Twilight's eyes.
Thank you. Now, let's get started.
Twilight continued where she'd left off. She grabbed Sunset's wrist and clasped one cuff around it, slowly lifting it towards the towel rack above her head and pulling her other wrist up to follow suit. With her arms bound above her head, Sunset felt even more exposed than before, causing the blush on her cheeks to darken.
So, what are you planning to do?
Sunset asked in a nervous tone, fidgeting in her seat and unable to meet Twilight's eyes as she looked over her.
I'm not sure yet. I want to get a basic look at your anatomy, then study some more basic physiological functions if I can.
The phrase, physiological functions, didn't do much to ease Sunset's nerves. She gulped as Twilight snapped a pair of rubber gloves on and moved in.
If at any time you feel any discomfort or want me to stop, please tell me.
In the current condition, discomfort was somewhat of an understatement. Still, some part of her reasoned that if she just let Twilight get this over with, she could go home and forget about this compromising position. If she was going to introduce Twilight to the rest of her friends, there was no doubt she was going to want to do this at some point anyway. Sunset inhaled sharply as Twilight's cold gloved hands felt below her bra, lightly brushing against her ribs. She closed her eyes and bit her lip as Twilight's hands made their way up her sides, occasionally putting pressure on certain areas. She examined her arms and hands as well, moving them around to see how they performed. She stopped a few times to jot down a note or two before returning to the act.
You seem to have a mostly normal human bone structure, apart from certain small deformities. It's almost as if the bones were stretched in some places,
Twilight said, looking closely at a particular spot on her elbow. Sunset wanted to explain about the mirror and her transformation to this, but her breath caught in her throat when Twilight came down and grabbed her by the cheek and looked deeply into her face. She turned her head, studying it carefully. The close proximity made Sunset's cheeks flush as her breathing sped up. She knew Twilight wasn't going to hurt her, but Sunset had a strong, sinking feeling in her stomach that still made her immensely nervous for some reason. With a gloved thumb, Twilight opened Sunset's mouth and inspected her tongue.
Excessive warmth. A much faster breathing rate than most humans.
Gee, I wonder why.
She had no idea how to handle the strange flurry of feelings that assaulted her. She'd been to a doctor's before, but this was very different somehow. Twilight grabbed a stethoscope off the counter, placing the cold metal against Sunset's chest.
Highly elevated heart rate as well. Possibly different metabolic levels.
Twilight said to herself as she jotted down a few notes.
Tell me, do members of your species share the same reproductive organs?
Sunset thought she felt nervous before, but now, she felt like her heart might stop altogether and her cheeks would set on fire.
What?
Of course you wouldn't know. Still being a high school student, you wouldn't have any sexual experience.
Sunset wanted to laugh at the sheltered bookworm's ill-conceived notions of high school life. The fact that she didn't even bat an eye at her harshest reaction yet meant she probably didn't know when to stop, so her chuckle quickly caught in her throat. Proving her point, Twilight reached behind her back and unclasped her bra. Shock shot through her system at the feeling of her breasts being freed, and before she could say anything, Twilight ran both of her hands across her breasts and gave them a light squeeze. Sunset's breath caught in her throat, and her eyes opened wide. She didn't even know her heart could beat so fast, but as Twilight felt around her breasts, it proved that notion very wrong.
Twilight.
Sunset barely got out under her breath. Her captor paid her no heed as she continued to examine her. Twilight's fingers felt around her tender flesh, leaving no part untouched. She even lifted her bra and watched as her thumb brushed across Sunset's nipple. Sunset bit her lips so hard she could swear she tasted blood.
We seem to share mostly similar mammary glands. The anatomy of the upper chest is surprisingly similar,
Twilight said, leaning back up and writing down some more notes. Sunset sighed and tried to regain control of her erratic breathing. She clenched her fists and shut her eyes tightly as she tried to come to grips with the feelings surrounding her. She fidgeted in her chair and found an odd wetness that spread between her legs. It was extremely uncomfortable once she realized the extent of her own arousal. Soaking most of the bottom of her panties and a good way along her inner thighs, her excitement was still warm on her skin. More than anything, she wanted to just get out of them and satisfy her own powerful urges coursing through her. Sunset's break was short-lived, however. Once Twilight finished her writing, she was right back to work, kneeling at Sunset's feet and sliding a boot off of one foot. Sunset's heart jumped into high gear once again as she realized just how close Twilight was to her rather obvious arousal.
What are you doing?
Once Twilight looked up to meet her gaze, Sunset found it difficult to keep eye contact.
Oh, I'm simply studying the anatomy of your lower body now. I hope you don't mind.
Of course not.
Sunset looked off to the side and bit her lip again, trying to stifle the excitement still building in her. She didn't know how long Twilight's obliviousness was going to last. Sunset could smell herself in the air now, and Twilight was much closer to that area than she was. Twilight ran her hands across Sunset's shins, taking off her socks and inspecting the movement of every joint in her knee and toes. While the touch still sent a flurry of emotions running through her, Sunset wasn't overwhelmed to the point where she couldn't think straight anymore. She tried to picture what she was going to do after this. Probably go straight home, strip all of her clothes off, and finally, take care of... Once she realized her hips were moving of their own accord, Sunset knew she had done nothing but make it worse. The yearning feelings inside of her worsened. If she didn't get some relief soon, she didn't know what she would do.
Seemingly normal, except for the strange formations across your skeleton.
Sunset wished she would just get it over with already. At this rate, she was going to be sprinting home, as to not drive herself crazy with desire.
I'd like to look more into your reproductive organs if that's alright with you.
Twilight asked, with her usual lack of understanding as to what that might imply. Sunset wasn't even paying attention at this point, as she simply uttered a quick,
Yeah, sure.
Sunset was much more preoccupied with trying to suppress her own feelings for a little while longer.
Good. Stand up and turn around, please.
Sunset did as she was told rather quickly. The sudden jerk against the handcuffs cut into her hands, causing her to wince.
Thank you. I'm almost done. Just a few more moments and I'll let you get dressed.
All of what Twilight had said had finally caught up with Sunset. A shock ran through her system at the thought of Twilight looking over that part of her. Her fears were realized when Twilight slipped her fingers into the waistband of her skirt and panties and began to slide them down her thighs, revealing her in her entirety, save for the bra hanging limply around her shoulders. Sunset bit her lip again. She had never thought she liked girls before, but all she wanted right now was for Twilight to drop the note-taking and stick a few fingers inside of her. A tiny part of Sunset chastised herself for thinking that, but the feelings radiating from between her legs completely drowned it out.
Oh, my very heightened sense of arousal in a non-sexual environment. That's strange.
Twilight said, a hint of embarrassment finally spilling into her tone. Sunset could feel Twilight that close, just a few more inches forward.
Miss Shimmer, could you hold still, please?
Sunset hadn't realized how much her hips were swaying, yearning for some sort of attention. She stopped. Every muscle in her legs needed to keep her subconscious movements at bay. Cold rubber traced across Sunset's lips, making her let out a ragged breath that held the beginnings of a moan. Twilight didn't seem to notice the movement of her hips backwards this time. 2 fingers ran through her folds, spreading them wide enough apart for Twilight to get a good look. Sunset saw her own excitement start to drip down her thighs, and even leave a few drops on the floor. Sunset couldn't hold it back this time. Her mouth opened as she let desire flow out of her. Twilight pulled her hand back, surely startled by the display.
Are you alright?
Twilight asked, her voice stumbling for the first time since they met. Sunset's only answer was her continued labored breaths and low hums of pleasure as her hips moved of their own accord. Twilight nervously cleared her throat and reached for the key to the handcuffs on the table. Sunset looked over to see her pale hand shaking, with Twilight herself sporting a soft blush.
Well, those are all the, physical examinations I needed, so you may go.
Twilight brushed up against her captive as she raised her arms to unlock the binds. Sunset could feel her warmth, smell her lavender shampoo, and imagine the taste of her pale skin under her lips. Twilight looked once towards Sunset, then immediately turned away, her blush intensifying as she saw the sheer amount of desire in Sunset's gaze. With a click, one hand of the handcuffs unlocked, and Sunset pulled both of her arms down and turned towards Twilight. Sunset ground her teeth as Twilight took an uncertain step back, clutching the keys with both hands close to her chest, almost frightened of something. Sunset knew exactly what it was. She was afraid of the same thing a few minutes ago.
You can, put your clothes back on.
Twilight said, unable to gaze in the direction of Sunset's bare body.
I'm sorry, Twilight.
Twilight looked back at her, making sure she kept her eyes directed at Sunset.
About what?
Sunset lunged forward, wrapping one arm around Twilight, and the other shooting between her legs, fulfilling the desire of her last 20 minutes. She moaned into Twilight's lips as she kissed her as deeply as her multitasking would allow. Sunset could feel Twilight heat up, feel her heartbeat skyrocket as she pressed her naked body against her. Twilight stood frozen for a moment, not sure of how to handle the situation. Sunset didn't give any time to react, as her free hand began to travel down her curves and pulled aside the dorky lab coat. Her hand found its way down the back of Twilight's pants, tracing along her ass until Sunset found her mark. Twilight gasped and broke away from Sunset's kiss. Sunset felt the warmth of her insides around 2 of her fingers, and the rest of her hand became soaked as well. Twilight gave a gentle coo as Sunset's fingers explored her folds, the strange feeling enveloping her. Sunset wasted no time in getting Twilight in the mood. With her still wet hand that wasn't focused on Twilight, she began to drag up her skirt. A gentle, shining wet line of Sunset's fluids traced its way across Twilight's skin. Sunset pulled away from Twilight's mouth and began to work on her neck, planting kisses anywhere she found suitable. Twilight reluctantly let a moan slip through her lips as her head fell back. Sunset's fingers found their way deeper with every thrust, pulling the otherwise timid girl deeper into the waves of her own pleasure.
Perhaps the bed would be a better place for this.
Good idea.
It was Sunset's turn to drag Twilight by the wrist. She hurried the pair towards Twilight's perfectly set bed. The purple sheets came unfurled from their tucks as Sunset threw the subject of her desire onto them. She ran her hands up the sides of Twilight's thighs until she found her waistband. Sunset ran her fingers under it, tracing her way across Twilight's skin until she found the button. Without wasting any time, she tore them off of her to get a clear look at just how much Twilight wanted her. Twilight still held some visage of nervousness, however. With a surprised yelp, she tucked her legs together when she felt the open air brush against her skin. The dark blush across her face and her timid expression only made the primal drive pushing Sunset to want her more. Sunset crawled onto the bed beside her and gently pushed her fingers between Twilight's thighs, spreading them apart. She planted gentle kisses along the insides of her leg, leading up to the true prize. Sunset could feel Twilight's intense heartbeat through her lips. It was even worse than hers. The feverish warmth she radiated filled Sunset with lust as she pushed onwards. After what seemed like an eternity to Twilight, Sunset finally planted a kiss on her wet lips. Twilight clutched her sheets tightly as Sunset worked over her. Sunset lapped at every fold she could reach, snaking her own hands down her navel, making the experience just as enjoyable for her. The heat coming off of Twilight was only rivaled by that of Sunset's cheeks. The mere thought of being with a girl like this had never crossed her mind before. The fact that it felt so wrong only made her push her fingers deeper into her burning lust. Twilight's strained breathing turned into small coos of pleasure. Sunset could tell she had no idea what to do with herself. Her hands ran across her sheets, looking for some support. Twilight tried to quiet herself, but to no avail. With every slick pass of Sunset's tongue over her folds, Twilight gradually lost herself in the feelings that it caused. Soon there was no doubt that she was enjoying Sunset's actions. Twilight shot her hands to Sunset's head. Still conscious of pushing boundaries, she gently ran her hands through her hair. Sunset looked up from between Twilight's legs, curious of her partner's reactions. The absence of Sunset's tongue made Twilight wince. She fidgeted and tried to push herself back towards Sunset's mouth, but was too timid to actually pull her back.
Please, don't stop,
Twilight said, barely above a whisper. Her ragged breaths barely let her say that much in the small breaks Sunset allowed her. With a satisfied smirk, Sunset went back to work. In addition to the increasing volume of her moans, Twilight began to twitch under her from certain licks. Sunset caught on, pushing Twilight further and further towards the edge. The sweet scent of Twilight's excitement enveloped Sunset's world, driving her crazy with lust. Sunset's own fingers pushed deeper and deeper into herself, and heard her own coos of pleasure flow into Twilight's slit. Twilight grabbed Sunset's hair hard, making sure she wasn't going anywhere. Sunset didn't mind. The sight of the timid girl under her tongue, arching her back and throwing her head back in unbridled passion, more than made up for it. With a final, elongated cry, Twilight came. Her entire body tensed, and the muscles around her folds began to convulse with the final bouts of pleasure from Sunset's work. Sunset could feel the contractions around her lips as she pushed Twilight along the final moments of her orgasm. After Twilight's orgasm began to subside, her grasp on Sunset's head loosened, and she fell limp. Twilight panted lightly, and Sunset smiled at the sight. Sunset took the opportunity to crawl up against her, unbuttoning Twilight's blouse, and allowing their bare chests to brush against each other. The feeling of Sunset's naked skin stirred Twilight out of her reverie, just in time to see Sunset move in for another kiss. Sunset didn't even bother to wipe her mouth, letting Twilight's liquid lust spread around each of their lips, flavoring their kiss in her own excitement. Sunset broke the kiss and gave Twilight a sultry gaze.
I hope you liked that.
Sunset grabbed Twilight's wrist and led her hand between them, slowly making her way down her navel and making Twilight's fingers brush against Sunset's folds.
Now I want something from you.
Sunset planted her lips on Twilight's, letting her hand go where it pleased between her legs. Sunset dared to finally meet tongues with Twilight. She seemed shocked at first, probably at the taste of herself, but quickly adapted to let their tongues play between their lips. Twilight abided Sunset's desire. With a timid, shaky hand, she slipped 2 fingers into Sunset's burning hot entrance, eliciting a sharp gasp from her former subject. Sunset secretly thanked herself for staying this long. Before today, she had no idea what wonders another person's fingers could hold. She felt her hips swaying into Twilight's hand as she pushed deeper into her, caressing all the little corners of her inner walls. Sunset broke the kiss again, unable to keep quiet any longer. She shut her eyes tightly, as even the slightest movement inside of her made her shudder. Sunset's arms felt unstable under her, each wave of pleasure sapping her strength, to the point where she thought she might just fall limp over Twilight. Twilight seemed to notice, and gently pushed Sunset off of her. Sunset finally let out a drawn-out moan from her lips, when the feeling of Twilight's fingers turning inside of her surged through her body. She didn't even notice when Twilight took her place between her legs at the edge of the bed. With a better angle, Twilight pushed her fingers deeper into Sunset at a much quicker pace. Sunset could feel the nervous shake of her hand, every little twitch of Twilight inside of her. Sunset picked her head up to see what Twilight was doing. Holding the same nervous expression she had when Sunset first kissed her, Twilight scanned Sunset's slip as her fingers moved in and out. She rested her offhand on Sunset's thigh, tracing across it and taking in the feeling of her soft skin. Sunset could feel Twilight's intense heartbeat through her hands. It would have been so cute to see Twilight blush so hard if Sunset wasn't so racked with desire. She wanted so much more. But Twilight still seemed too timid to go any farther. Sunset's lust was starting to fade since Twilight slowed down in her efforts, the sight of her finger-fucking Sunset seemingly overwhelming. Sunset sat up on her elbows to face Twilight, but just as she did, a look of resolution came over Twilight's face. She closed her eyes and dove face first into Sunset's folds. Sunset immediately cried out. Twilight had obviously done her research. Her fingers touched her in just the right places, and her tongue made sure Sunset's clit never had a break. Sunset's body took on a mind of its own. Her hands grabbed desperately at the sheets, as her head tossed back and forth, as she unwillingly yelled at Twilight's actions. Every little bump on Twilight's tongue sent a shock of pleasure through her entire body, radiating out from between her legs. Twilight's fingers caressed the one spot Sunset never knew she yearned for to be touched. Her near-expert level of finesse had Sunset on the edge sooner than she had ever dreamed. Even as Twilight pushed her over the edge into the best orgasm she'd ever felt, she showed no signs of stopping. Strange feelings of intense satisfaction branched out to every last nerve ending in her body. Sunset wrapped her own legs around Twilight, pulling her close as her toes curled with the tensing of her entire body. Sunset's voice felt ragged after screaming so loudly under Twilight's touch. Only after the last of Sunset's convulsions subsided did Twilight finally pull away from Sunset's sex, her fingers sliding out of her wet insides. Sunset slumped down off the bed and onto Twilight's lap. Sunset basked in the afterglow and lovingly kissed Twilight on the neck, lazily brushing her shirt and coat off of her shoulders so that she might feel their skin meet again.
Was that adequate?
Twilight asked quietly, apprehension still thick in her voice. Sunset laid her head on Twilight's shoulder and quietly giggled at her.
Yeah, Twilight. That was wonderful.
Sunset felt content to stay like that forever, feeling Twilight's warmth and having her arms wrapped around her. After about a minute, though, Twilight seemed to have a panic attack and shot up from under Sunset, leaving her splayed haphazardly across the floor. She raised an irritated eyebrow at Twilight, who stood in absolute terror in front of her.
My parents are going to be home any minute. You have to leave.
Twilight said, reaching for Sunset quickly and grabbing her by the wrist.
Twilight, what?
No time. Oh, what would my parents think?
Twilight rushed her into the bathroom and began picking up and shoving her clothes towards her. Twilight chewed at her nails nervously as she searched her bathroom and bedroom for all the articles of clothing that had been stripped off and frantically putting them back on. Twilight's hurried disposition had Sunset a bit nervous as well. She tried to put her own clothes back on quickly, but her limbs were still lethargic from the recent action. With one sock in her hand, her skirt not zipped up all the way, and her hair still sticking out in random directions and not pulled out of her shirt, Twilight hurried her down the stairs and to the front door, carefully looking out each window to make sure there was no one watching. Twilight didn't look much better, with her hair still frazzled and her pants not even buttoned up. There really was no hiding the fact that the two of them had just had sex, but she expected nothing less if this Twilight was anything like her pony form.
So, do you want to hang out again sometime? I have a couple of people I would love you to meet,
Sunset said, pulling her hair out and straightening her skirt. She gave Twilight an easygoing smile, hoping to put her at ease. Twilight stopped in her frantic motions for a moment, and a blush returned to her face.
Oh, sure. I think meeting again would be nice.
Twilight struggled to maintain eye contact, as the thoughts of the last hour seemed to rush through her mind.
We don't have to, you know.
Sunset said, motioning up to her bedroom.
We could just hang out, you know, as friends.
An awkward moment of silence hung between them, after Twilight nodded and offered a timid smile at the prospect.
I guess I'll be going then,
Sunset said, reaching for the door.
Wait!
Twilight reached for Sunset, but pulled her hand back, embarrassed.
Should we kiss goodbye?
Twilight asked, staring nervously at the wall. Sunset looked her over, thinking about how adorable she was. She pulled her close and gave her one last, deep kiss before leaving her stammering in the doorway.
See you soon, Twilight,
Sunset said as she walked down the yard towards the sidewalk. If today was any indication, this was going to be a very good summer. The end. Yep. That's a permanent wing boner. It's stuck like this. Well, gonna be talking like this then. Well, that was Subject of Desire. I know you all enjoyed it, and I certainly did. So a big special thank you to our two lovely voice actresses, Miss Kagome as Twilight, and Miss Kate Pug as Sunset Shimmer. And a special thank you to Wooten for helping me organize this. Thank you, Wooten. This has been a long time coming. Now my Month of Lurve Special, and my Hearts and Hooves Day Special, even though I messed up the dates, because I can't do dates, because, you know, I suck at these things. Yeah. This was originally supposed to be my 2,000 subscriber special, but that never happened because I suck at dates, if that isn't obvious yet. Because life sucks. Anyway, happy Hearts and Hooves Day, happy Singles Awareness Day, be lovely to each other, that's Scribbler's line, and this is ASTRO BRONY, signing off. This has been going on for more than 4 hours. I should probably call a doctor.